Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. Here at the museum we tell the story of the British Army and the people who served in it from the Civil War to the present day through our galleries, collections, programmes and research. There are many ways you can support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. So today I'm delighted to welcome David Lambert. David is Professor of Caribbean History at the University of Warwick and co-director of the Centre for Caribbean Studies. His research is concerned with empire, race, warfare and slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries, focusing on the Caribbean. He has authored and co-authored multiple books on the topic, including Soldiers of Uncertain Rank, the West India Regiments in British Imperial Culture. Today, he'll be exploring the history of the West India Regiment. So just a tech note, we have had some Wi-Fi wobbles today, so please, if something goes wrong, if our stream drops out, this video will be available after the talk on YouTube or Vimeo. So if anything does go wrong, please be gentle with us. Otherwise, if your stream freezes, try refreshing. Usually that cures all ills. Otherwise, there will be a member of staff in the chat feature ready to answer any questions you may have. There will be a chance to ask questions to David at the end of the talk, both for our in-person audience, so you put your hands up and I come around with a microphone, or for our online audience, we have a Q&A chat feature. So now I've said all that, I'm now going to hand over to David.
Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Amy, and thank you to the National Army Museum for inviting me to speak today. The title of the talk comes from as Amy said, my new book, which came out at the end of last year. It's an academic book, which means it comes with the kind of prizes you expect of academic books, unfortunately. There are some flyers at the back which do come with a discount, so if you're interested, I'd encourage you to take one of them. I should also acknowledge that this book is was part of a bigger project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council that I undertook with colleagues at the University of Warwick, and also with the British Library and with the Museum of London Docklands. So it's the combination, or it's an element of something bigger. Okay, so let's start close to home. In 2018, the National Army Museum acquired this really remarkable painting. It dates from the early years of the 19th century. We don't know who created it. And it depicts a private of the 8th West India Regiment. The green plume would indicate this is a member of the regiment's light company, supposedly consisting of the smallest and quickest men who were used for things like scouting and skirmishing. The private stands to attention in the course of presenting arms, musket with bayonet attached, as though he's performing a manual drill. And in a sense, that's what we as the viewers are doing. We're inspecting him as he performs a drill. Tents and other uniform figures can be seen to the rear, as well as a coastline and some small vessels, and most importantly, a couple of palm trees that denote that this setting is the Caribbean. And the palm tree as symbol that this is the Caribbean is very, very common, and I'll show you some other examples later on. Now, there's nothing particularly unusual about the depiction of army personnel from the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, including ordinary soldiers. What is more unusual, of course, is his ethnicity. The West India Regiments were established by the British in the Caribbean from the mid-1790s as part of the regular British Army, and that's really important to understand. These are not colonial auxiliaries. These are part of the British Army, and they were uniformed as such. Consolidating some existing units, including African-American men who'd fought for the British in the American Revolutionary War, the numbers are greatly augmented through the conscription of enslaved African men bought directly from slave traders in the late 1790s and early 1800s. At one point, the British Army is the single biggest purchaser of slaves. Although his identity is unknown, this is a fairly naturalistic portrait of an individual man, probably based on the direct experience of a regimental officer on the spot. He's presented as a soldier, carrying his weapon and in a military setting. This isn't some kind of crude caricature, and there were many crude caricatures of African people at this time, but this is not that. Moreover, representing perhaps the earliest known visual depiction of the West India Regiments, albeit one that doesn't seem to have appeared in print, doesn't seem to have circulated in printed form, the painting, for me, is emblematic of a particular way of viewing the West India Regiments that's established very, very early on and that will have profound consequences. If we roll forward more than 100 years, we find a very different image of a West India Regiment soldier. I've picked him out from the crowd. This was printed in an illustrated magazine called The Boy's Own Paper. And this is fairly typical of the kind of late Victorian, early Edwardian kind of jingoistic literature aimed at young boys, kind of like sport, empire, the army, the navy. These are the kind of features of this kind of periodical. By this point, there's only one West India Regiment left. There had been 12 at one point, but there's only one left by 1912. And in striking contrast with the early 19th century painting, this private is portrayed not wearing the uniform of Britain's foot regiments, but rather a wholly different type of uniform based on that of France's Zouave forces. That martial style had become very popular, particularly in the aftermath of the Crimean War, and is applied to the West India Regiments in the late 1850s. And this is at a time when France's Zouave forces are very highly regarded and emulated. This style is copied by a number of militaries around the world. The Zouave is seen as a kind of the elite soldier embodying a new kind of loose warfare in the mid-19th century. But this is the 1910s, and by this point, the West India Regiment soldier stands as a rather exotic leftover of a bygone military age. It's noticeable, all the khaki around him, and the Zouave, he looks more like a bandsman than an infantryman. Another difference, of course, between the two images is that this West India Regiment soldier does not stand alone, but rather accompanied by 29 other military figures. This is a body of men drawn from across the British Empire, including the colonies of Australia and Canada, and there are also representatives of the Indian Army. And these kind of collective martial images, where you have a kind of whole host of soldiers together, has become quite common by the late 19th century. It's part of a wider sort of popular militarism, which you also see in things like collectible cards, toy soldiers, jingoistic literature, and kind of public pageants and parades, which had become all the rage. Now, whilst this kind of multi-ethnic grouping is supposed to convey quite a positive message, it's the idea that the British Empire may be diverse, but it's unified in a kind of common cause. Nonetheless, by including a representative of the West India Regiment among this group, the prince is performing a sleight of hand. This is because, as I said, the West India Regiment was part of the regular British Army. It was not a colonial force like the Trinidad Light Infantry, represented by the two figures in white pith helmets, or a Victoria Ranger, the man with crossed legs. In other words, the West India Regiment man does not belong in this military company. This is no minor quibble. His presence here not only exemplifies the increasing marginalization of the West India Regiments by this period, by the early 20th century, but also a kind of, well, quoting the title of the book, an uncertainty about where the regiments fitted in that was there from the very start. Despite the differences, though, there are some similarities between the figures. Both privates stand in a formal pose, as though they're ready for inspection, rather than action. And as I said, we, gazing at them, are kind of assessing them. And in the book, I argue that the image of the West India Regiment soldiers as oddly passive figures with a kind of military value that has to be constantly reassessed and confirmed is a recurrent theme, not only of how they appear in visual images, but also how people will write about them. And this has consequences for how the British public view them, and it also has consequences for how they are used militarily. That's the argument of the book anyway. So soldiers of uncertain rank is concerned then with the changing image of soldiers of the West India Regiment. These images, I argue, matter. They do tell us far more about how the men are viewed by outsiders than about the men themselves, that's true, but these images are crucial. Prior to the formal abolition of the British slave trade in 1807, the bulk of recruits to the West India Regiments were enslaved African men and boys purchased from slave traders. After Britain ends its formal involvement in the slave trade and the Royal Navy begins to step up patrols against foreign slave ships, So-called liberated Africans captured, liberated by the British, many of them end up in the West India Regiments too. Owing both to their origins in slavery and with a rank and file overwhelmingly composed of men of African descent, the history of the regiments is unique in the British Army. Commanded by white officers, at least until right at the end of the 19th century, the officers are always white. Commanded by white officers, they are often talked about as if they represented a kind of an idealized way in which the hierarchies of empire should work, with white officers leading and black soldiers following. And the men are often spoken about in highly paternalistic manners. Yet the West India Regiment's men did enjoy some equality, much equality, with other soldiers in the British regiment, not least as expressed in the uniform itself. They also had complex relations with other people of African descent, whether that's the enslaved people who they, in the Caribbean colonies, until slavery is abolished in the 1830s, and then the black civilian population thereafter, or indeed various African peoples after the regiments were posted to that continent from the 1820s. And as such, the West India Regiments hold this really interesting and ambiguous place within what we might think of the British Empire, but within British imperial and military culture. And what I try to do in the book is I show that by kind of tracing this image of the West India Regiments over the 19th century, we can see how it intersects with a whole series of other interesting things that are going on. Debates about slavery and freedom, debates about Britishness and racial difference, debates about savagery and civilization, debates about heroism and duty. And this is why the image matters. During their existence of more than 130 years, West India Regiment soldiers served across the Caribbean, including what's now Belize and Guyana. They also participated in the War of 1812. And from the 1820s, they were deployed at Sierra Leone, the Gambia, and what's now present-day Ghana and Nigeria, as well as elsewhere in West Africa. Numbering 12 at their peak, there was only a single regiment comprised of 2 battalions remaining after 1888, and that final regiment is disbanded in 1927. There's a brief talk about bringing them back in the 1950s, which I can talk about if people wish. Throughout this history, the martial capabilities of the men of the West India Regiments was often questioned. We see this most sharply at the beginning of their history. When they're raised in the Caribbean in the 1790s, there are white British colonists, the planters, the slave owners, the merchants, who, although they form the minority, dominate the islands like Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados, politically, economically, legally. They dominate those islands. For them, the creation of the West India Regiments is not something to be welcomed. It's not something that will defend them against internal threat or French invasion. It's something to be feared. And they try really hard to dissuade the British Army from taking this path. They're seen as a threat to the status quo. And that status quo, to be clear, is white supremacism and racial slavery, just to be really clear. But even after such sentiment recedes by the 1830s, even decades later, there were many, including very senior military figures, who would continue to express skepticism about the value of the regiments. So as I said, in the book I explore the kind of changing visual and textual image of the West India Regiments, particularly their ordinary soldiers. And I'm just going to do something slightly academic, but very brief, because there's a particular idea I use in the book that's a helpful one, which those of you who are kind of interested in the British Army might want to think about too. And this is the notion of what an American academic called Scott Miley calls military spectacle. Military spectacle. And by this term, he's referring to the distinctive clothing, equipment, badges, colours, music, ceremonies, rituals, forms of address, and forms of bodily deportment associated with the military. This is military spectacle. These elements were experienced by soldiers every day, and Miley argues that the manipulation of military spectacle is crucial to how the British, or how armies create discipline and create and maintain morale. It's also important, he argues, for recruitment, for appealing to ideas of male prowess or patriotism or idealism. Military spectacle, particularly, of course, the uniform, which is the most obvious element of military spectacle, marks the soldier off from the wider population, and it's brought to public attention through reviews and pageants, as well as being represented in visual forms. And in this way, military spectacle is something that exerts both a strong psychological and emotional influence on the soldiers, but also shapes how they're viewed by outsiders. Now, the military spectacle of the West India Regiments was is absolutely crucial. One of the reasons why this image is so dramatic, why it's such a fantastic painting, is when the West India Regiments are first created in the 1790s, Britain is basically at war with France in the Caribbean. This is a huge theatre of conflict. At one point, a third of the British Army are fighting in the Caribbean. Early on, things go really well for the British. They capture key French islands. They capture Martinique, they capture Guadeloupe, they capture Saint Lucie. They send large numbers of soldiers into what's now Haiti, Saint-Domingue, which is the great prize. It's the wealthiest colony in the Caribbean. Things go well for the British initially. But then some French reinforcements arrive, and crucially, the French abolish slavery in all the territories that they still hold. And what that does is it dramatically changes the balance of power in the Caribbean. The British now find themselves not just fighting the French army, as in like French regulars or militia, they're now fighting essentially the population of French colonies. They're forced out of Guadeloupe, they're forced out of Saint Lucie, and then the French are able to help stir up revolts in the British colonies of Grenada and St. Vincent. And meanwhile, the British army is suffering terribly in Saint-Domingue, Haiti. So the British go from a position of being on the front foot to decidedly being on the back foot. They're fighting this kind of multi-ethnic alliance where the bulk of the people who are actually fighting for the French look like this too, that they're in French uniforms. They're also of African descent. So for the British to take this act is an act of desperation. They're being beaten back, the soldiers are dying of yellow fever, and they look for a new source of soldiers, and they take this act and they create the West India Regiments. But they won't offer them freedom. They never go as far as the French in a kind of, temporarily at least, offering generalized freedom. They don't ever emancipate until the 1830s. So the uniform and pay and treatment and weapons are almost as much as they can offer to these men to try to make them at least, if not loyal to the British cause, at least to assure compliance with the British cause. So this, it might not look at it, but this is a very radical image. A very radical image is as far as the British are prepared to go while still maintaining slavery and white supremacism, which is why that's the status quo the British are defending. Now, a question I'm always asked when I talk about the West India Regiments is, well, did the men in the West India Regiments internalize this view? Were they supporting the British? People say, why didn't they just turn their guns on their officers straight away and kill them? And, people always try to wonder about what did the men think? We can look at the outside of them, they can look at their appearance. What did the men think? The problem is, and this is a kind of standard historical problem, is that the perspective of the soldiers is almost impossible to assess. We have hardly any records that give the opinions of the men themselves. Usually it's a courts-martial, and they are very unusual. But just because there's silence doesn't mean that the men were passive. And there's kind of wider work that's been done on kind of the way in which soldiers, because we don't, from this period of time, the late 18th, early 19th century, we don't know what most soldiers thought, whether they were of African descent or European descent. We just don't know what they thought. It's not until really the First World War when people are writing letters and we have some sense of what, ordinary soldiers are thinking about. But nonetheless, soldiers did have agency. Life in the army offered opportunities for many: social advancement, material betterment, escape from an unwanted pregnancy, perhaps leaving a poor woman alone, chance to travel beyond one's immediate home. And whilst these forms of agency may not have been available to West India Regiment soldiers because of how most had been initially bought to serve in the British Army, the men were not passive. And it is highly suggestive that the first of 3 mutinies that takes place amongst the West India Regiments, which is not very many given the length of their history, the very first mutiny that takes place in 1802 takes place when there are amid rumours that the regiment is going to be disbanded and that the men are going to be sold back into slavery and to labour on plantations. And the fact that at this point the men had their guns taken away from them and had been given cutlasses and hoes and were given the job of clearing the land near their base in preparation for the planting of sugarcane, and the fact that the additional monies that they should have been receiving for those kind of extra activities was at best patchy, only lent credence to such fears. In the context then of an apparent threat to their military status, the men took action and mutinied. They defended their status as soldiers, which would suggest they had internalized it. They had, got with the message. But such mutinies were, in general, the exception. And the broader success of British Army discipline, the power exerted by military spectacle, was evident in the fact that through most of their history, the men of the West India Regiments largely did their duty in soldiering, killing, and dying for Britain across its empire. Now, the military spectacle of the West India Regiments was also intended to send a message about how they should be viewed by others, how they should be viewed by the wider population. After all, a military uniform is something which differentiates civilian from a non-civilian person, as well as, of course, expresses identity with one's comrades. But when we're talking about soldiers of African descent serving in places where most people living in those places are also of African descent, but are enslaved, you can just imagine the kind of the frisson that this would bring. And this is one of the reasons why the white colonists, the planters, the merchants who dominated these islands politically were so worried about them. They were worried that slaves would just see this, see people with authority, see people finely dressed, frankly, in the comparison of how a plantation worker would be dressed, and it would almost like undermine the status quo in their minds almost. It would sort of overturn the system that was in place. And this is an interesting thing that you see that happens is when the regiments are based in certain parts of, when they say are moved to Jamaica, the white authorities, the local colonial authorities are determined to keep them out of the way. If they're going to have them in Jamaica, they want them in forts that are kind of away from major population centres where no one's really going to see them, sort of out of sight, out of mind. Now, the military spectacle of the West India Regiments, I try to show in the book, also circulates more widely as it's represented in newspaper accounts, in compendia of uniforms, and indeed in occasional works of art. And I'll show you a work of art that may not be familiar in a moment. This is probably, until relatively recently, the most famous image of a West India Regiment soldier. This is a member of the 5th. Which is on display here in this museum. Those of you who are interested in the kind of Napoleonic period may recognize this as a Charles Hamilton Smith view of the British Army dating from 1812 to 1815. So many books that are about the kind of Peninsular War and then the prelude to Waterloo often use Charles Hamilton Smith's images to illustrate the British Army. And he had one of the West India Regiments too. And again, just notice a couple of things that are similar to the image I already showed you. He's standing ready to be inspected. He's not doing any fighting or even in quite a formal pose. And again, of course, we have the palm tree. So what I try to do then in the book is I try to trace the image of the West India Regiments across the 19th century. A lot of the work that has been done, there's not been much, but a lot of the work that has been done on the West India Regiments so far has tended to focus on their creation and the very first few decades of their service. And I try to do something different, which is think about them all the way through to their disbandment, and indeed the way in which they continue to be sort of remembered or not today. And the way the book works is that it's kind of chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are the main meat of the book. And they're basically there are 3 pairs of chapters that look at a different historical period. So the first 2 and 3 are about the creation of the regiments and their early years when slavery still exists in the Caribbean, which is the main place they're still serving. Chapters 4 and 5 move on to the kind of mid-Victorian period, 1850s, 1860s, and I begin to start to look at their service in Africa, because that's as they begin to do more work there. And then chapters 6 and 7 are about the kind of late Victorian period, what people used to call the role in the kind of scramble for Africa and the kind of expansion of the British Empire. And chapter 7 is about the Diamond Jubilee, so 60th anniversary of Queen Victoria's ascension to the throne and the place of the West India Regiments in those celebrations. And what I try to do across these chapters is place the image, this as expressed in writing, as well as expressed in images, in visual images. I try to place that in relation to contextualize it, to consider it in relation to changes in styles of military painting or debates about scientific racism or whatever, these kind of issues. And what I just want to do just briefly is to explain the kind of context for the first two substantive chapters, 2 and 3. So to remind you, these two chapters are concerned with the creation of the regiments all the way through to basically the 1830s. And that period happens to also be the period, it's when slavery still exists in the British Empire. It's also the period, though, where a political campaign has emerged in Britain and elsewhere to end slavery. So a formal campaign against slavery starts up in the late 1780s. The slave trade is abolished in 1807, and then slavery itself is abolished in the 1830s. And that is quite a long drawn out, 50 or so years of intense political campaigning, both in favor of slavery, to keep slavery in place, and against slavery. And many people, you'll probably be familiar with the abolitionists, your Wilberforces and your Clarksons, the kind of anti-slavery people, and I'll talk about them briefly. But there's also a highly organized pro-slavery campaign going on. There are people who own enslaved people, who own land in the Caribbean. There are merchants who trade in the goods that enslaved people produce, coffee, cotton, sugarcane, indigo, etc., etc. There are people who trade in enslaved people themselves, who are enjoying themselves. I live near to Leamington Spa, and this is a place where many of these people went to take the waters to recover from the arduous work they had of making enslaved people do all their work for them in the Caribbean. And these people had politicians who were supportive of their efforts, and they had paid agents. And they mount a very effective, well-financed campaign in favor of slavery. And they make various arguments. They argue that slavery is biblically sanctioned. They say, well, slavery's not that bad. It's a kind of necessity. And they also they essentially produce, I suppose you call it political propaganda, to try and shape, to create a certain image of African people, either as contented, basically say, they're basically happy, slavery is not really bad. Being an enslaved person on a plantation in Jamaica is better than being a labouring person in Lancashire or a soldier in the British Army. They make that kind of their contented argument. And then they also do an oddly reverse argument, which is they're dangerous savages. If we don't have slavery, they'll kill us all. Only slavery can keep them in place. So they're the kind of arguments they use in favour of slavery. And they are faced with an anti-slavery movement that tries to humanize enslaved people, to say, no, slavery is an evil, slavery is immoral, it's against Christ's teaching, various different sorts of arguments people make. They try to portray enslaved people as human, as suffering when their families are broken up or when they're abused, and to try and generate sympathy and empathy amongst the British public. And this is, I'm sure many of you will recognize this is perhaps the most famous anti-slavery image, originally associated with Josiah Wedgwood, the great pottery industrialist. And this image becomes printed on pamphlets. Women would wear it on brooches. It becomes, you can get sugar bowls with it appearing on to show that your household is we don't consume West Indian sugar, we abstain, we're an abstention family. This, of course, is a stereotype as well. It's a stereotype that portrays African people as victims who need to be freed, and that's certainly not the reality. Enslaved people rose up, they ran away, they did all sorts of things, but it portrays them as a victim in order to try and generate sympathy from the British public. The point is that just as these pro- and anti-slavery images and campaigning is going on, these sorts of images are also in circulation. This is an image from 1795, the year when the West India Regiments are first created. This is an image from a history of the Caribbean by a very famous member of Parliament, a man called Brian Edwards, who was also one of the most staunchest defenders of slavery. Specifically, this is an image of a Maroon captain. The Maroons were groups of people who essentially, they or their descendants had escaped from slavery and established themselves somewhat autonomously in places like the interior of Jamaica. In 1795, one of these groups starts a war against the British authorities, and this is an image of one of their leaders, Leonard Parkinson, a captain of the Maroons. This is what all those opponents of the West India Regiments were worried about, those white colonists. This is the dangerous armed black man. He's got a gun. Who knows what he's going to do next? This is a dangerous figure. These people need to be kept in order. And it's worth saying that the British are fighting people just like this across the Caribbean at this time. They're fighting them in Grenada, they're fighting them in St. Vincent, they're fighting them in St. Lucia. Those of you who know John Moore died, 1809, that John Moore. He spends almost 12 months fighting a group he calls the Brigands. That's the term the British use to describe these dangerous armed African people who are fighting against them, fighting for their freedom. They call them brigands. The point I try to make in the book is that just as there were pro- and anti-slavery images, there is a military equivalent to that. And the military equivalent of that on the opposite side is that. It's the disciplined armed black man who is reliable, who can be trusted, who will do his duty for the British. These are also stereotypes, and I argue that from the very beginning, because there's a certain amount of opposition to the regiments, a certain anxiety about what they're doing, this act of desperation of arming these people, the image of the regiments is almost constrained. They're shown as passive. It's very, very hard to find any images of them ever doing any fighting. There's almost like a cost that comes with trying to win the hearts and minds of the British public. And the cost is that these men are rendered oddly passive, even though they are soldiers. And what I'm going to try to do now is to show you the consequences of that, the real-world consequences of that oddly passive image. And I would argue, I should say, that these are equivalent. These are the same sort of images. They are both images that sort of portray armed or unarmed men of African descent as passive and needing leadership. But let me come to a kind of real-world consequences of some of this. Oh, and there's another one. Same image. Exactly the same. Standing there, passively, palm tree, being inspected. Okay. Consider the depiction of Private Samuel Hodge. Does anyone know anything about Private Samuel Hodge? I'm getting some nods. Yes, anyone? He is.
Yes, he had a plaque on the wall in the chapel of that character in the 1950s. He won a Victoria Cross, I think, in the Ashanti War in Ghana.
Earlier than that, but exactly right. He's the first African Caribbean soldier to win the Victoria Cross.
Specifically about him, actually, at the museum, the West India Museum,
I curated that museum. that was my music. That was my exhibition. But thank you. Did you see it then? Yes. Wonderful. Perfect. I'm very pleased. So this is Samuel Hodge, the first African Caribbean soldier to win the Victoria Cross. He was a private in the 4th West India Regiment, and he was serving in West Africa when his unit was involved in an assault against a stockaded village close to the River Gambia. And for his bravery in breaching the defences, he was awarded Britain's highest military honour, though sadly he died of his wounds in early 1868. And in one of the chapters of the book, I look at this event and the coverage of the event. There's some poems written about him, there's various press coverage about him, he appears in some books, and then we have this painting. Now, this is a painting, the title, which is interesting, is The Capture of Tubaba-Kalong, Gambia, 1866, by a generally now forgotten English artist called Louis William Desonge, who's no Lady Butler, but he was a kind of, from sort of 10, 15 years before, he was known as a society painter. He painted particularly aristocratic women, but he also became best known for his paintings of the winners of the Victoria Cross, particularly from the Crimean War and then from the Great Mutiny, the First War of Indian Independence, which obviously follows quickly afterwards. These paintings, and there are an increasing number of them, were on display at the Crystal Palace in the 1860s and 70s. They were reproduced in books. They go on tour. At one point, they're in Ireland. At one point, they're in Australia. And these are probably the best known, most familiar images of contemporary warfare in the mid-Victorian period. Now, when I'm talking about this to less enlightened audiences, and I say, this is a painting of a winner of the Victoria Cross, point them out to me, you can imagine a lot of people point to him and assume that the man we see face on, who is kind of lit, who's standing, who seems very prominent, must be the winner of the Victoria Cross. And that was George Darcy, who was a civilian colonial administrator who took command of the final assault. And it's hard to see because of the lighting here, but he's basically just shot the leader of the kind of opposing force, whereas Hodge, who is this gentleman here, is assisting Darcy by handing over weapons and keeping open the breach whilst reinforcements arrive. And what I try to show is that just how different Desonge's portrayal of Hodge is to all these other paintings of Victoria Cross winners, where the VC winner or winners are front and centre, usually doing the thing that they won the Victoria Cross for, shooting someone, stabbing someone, saving an officer. They are the main piece of the paintings. Whereas here, Hodge is somewhat out of the way to one side, where the main action seems to be going on elsewhere. It's also noticeable that this is the only painting that Desonge did that is not named after the man who won the Victoria Cross. It's named after the action, whereas every single other painting Desonge did is named after the person or people who won the Victoria Cross. And I'm sure some of you are possibly thinking, gosh, that reminds me a bit of that, the fact that he's kneeling. That idea of the kneeling African figure is quite a common theme still by this point. So we have here a painting of what at first sight would seem to be an obvious act of military heroism, recognized as such by a member of the West India Regiment. But the way in which it's not only portrayed in this painting, but also covered in the press, is that Hodge is rather pushed to one side. He's rather marginalized. And a lot of attention has gone on to the fact that Darcy, under the terms of the Victoria Cross at that time, regretting that he couldn't have won the Victoria Cross too. And so what I try to argue here is that that kind of image, that kind of oddly passive way in which the West India regiments are often represented, even plays out when they're doing something obviously military and obviously heroic. These questions also have implications on the battlefield too. The West India regiments participated in the 1873-1874 Anglo-Ashanti War, which is a really interesting campaign. It's probably, it is. It's the first colonial campaign that really captures the British public's attention. It brings the commanding officer of the expedition, which is part of the second part of the war, to great public prominence, which is Garnet Joseph Wolseley, the very model of a modern major general, the person who will rise to become the leader, the commander of the British Army overall. And the War of 1873-74 is one of the reasons why it takes on such prominence is because there are a large number of newspaper correspondents who joined the expedition, who joined the war halfway through, when a British expeditionary force, which has arrived from Europe, is marching up from what's now the southern Ghana towards the capital of the Ashanti Empire in Kumasi. And for Wolseley, the commanding officer of the expedition, and for many of the senior officers around him who left accounts, and for many of the newspaper correspondents who were embedded in the expedition, this campaign really mattered. The Ashanti had been a prominent antagonist against the British before. They inflicted a series of defeats against the British all the way back to the 1820s, famously or infamously. A man called Charles McCarthy, who's a British colonial governor, has his head taken, and supposedly the skull is used by the Ashanti. And for Wolseley and the men around him, they understood this. I mean, in the book, I call it a race war. This is European soldiers fighting African warriors. And Wolseley writes in his journal, he says, "The eyes of Africa are upon me. We must be seen to prevail here. You know, if we don't beat them, and if we don't beat them with white soldiers on their home ground, it's going to be a kind of blow against our status, our reputation." But the West India regiments are in this war too. And indeed, in the first half of the war, before Wolseley arrives with his European reinforcements, the West India regiments, both the 1st and 2nd regiments, are the main British regulars who are doing the fighting. And they, of course, they don't fit into that story of European soldiers fighting African warriors, because they're black British soldiers who are regulars, not auxiliaries. They're part of the British Army too, but they kind of get written out. And this has some interesting consequences on the ground itself. When Wolseley arrives, he doesn't think much of the West India regiments. He's already decided that he wants European reinforcements. And as his expeditionary force begins to march north towards Kumasi, he converts the West India Regiments into baggage handlers and makes them carry the white soldiers' equipment. He cuts the rations, he puts them on the same rations as the native levies that he's using, even though they're regular soldiers. And when the expedition finally reaches the Ashanti capital of Kumasi, he keeps the West India Regiment soldiers outside. And the officers of the West India Regiments at the time write that this was a deliberate slight, that they're not allowed to enter, even though they'd been involved in the war from the beginning, they're not allowed to kind of taste the spoils of victory, I suppose. So in other words, this ambiguous status at best has real consequences for how men like Wolseley think about and use the West India Regiments on the ground. I go on in the book, and I'm going to start to bring things to a close here. I go on in the book briefly to talk about, I don't talk about it briefly in the book, I talk about it quite extensively, the place of the West India Regiments in the Diamond Jubilee of 1897 and in kind of wider commemorative events. This is, as I said, 60 years since Victoria had ascended to the throne, and representatives from military units from across the world, from across the empire, are present in London for this huge parade. And I say, I won't go into detail here, but during the massive parade that's at the heart of the Diamond Jubilee celebrations, the men of the West India Regiments, there's 12 soldiers, including another Victoria Cross winner, don't march with the rest of the British Army. They march behind the British Army, they march behind the Canadians, they march behind the Australians, they march behind the Indian Army. They're basically right at the back, in amongst all the kind of colonial auxiliary forces of various sorts from across the British Empire. So if you want, their military status as part of the British Army is trumped by a kind of an imperial logic, I suppose, and they're kept right to the back. The book ends by thinking about the commemorative afterlives of the regiments, about how we remember them, how we don't. It's really noticeable, for example, that how often, when I've talked about the West India Regiments, people will say, oh, you mean the British West Indies Regiment that was raised in Jamaica and fought in the First World War? And I'll go, no, I mean the older West India Regiment that predates that. And that confusion about where these men fit in with other sorts of, how they fit in with the British Army, how they fit in with other units, I think is very, very telling. It's fantastic that a place like the National Army Museum has a painting like this here, and other images too. They are an important part of the story of the British Army. And I want to finish by taking things in a slightly different direction to how the West India Regiments are still commemorated to this day. Has anyone been to this audio trail at St. Paul's Cathedral that launched autumn of last year? Okay. If I could mark your cards, I'd strongly recommend it. Given your interests clearly here, I think you might find this very interesting too. So, War and Resistance in the Caribbean is a project that was put together by some colleagues of mine at the University of Warwick, an African Caribbean heritage organization called St. Vincent's and the Grenadines Second Generation, SV2G, and working with St. Paul's Cathedral. And those of you who know St. Paul's will be aware that there's a large number of memorials to British Army and naval officers who fought in the Caribbean in the 1790s. So Abercrombie's there, or Faulkner, or, Nelson obviously, but John Moore's there, and so on. There's a whole series of figures. And what this audio trail does is it essentially explains, you walk around, listen to it, these people explain to you. It explains what did it mean to serve in the West Indies in the 1790s. Why were they there? What were they doing? And it explains what was John Moore up to when he was in St. Lucia, and why was so many British soldiers and sailors sent to, and why did they die in the region? And the image that they use to illustrate the trail is this one here. And this is an interesting pantheon of figures. I had asked my students to name some of these people. I'm not going to ask people here, but they're essentially the figures to the rear. If you ignore the soldier, which is obviously based on that, if you ignore him, the figures to the rear are essentially the sorts of people the British were fighting against in the Caribbean in the 1790s. They are free people of colour who were trying to maintain racial equality, which the British didn't want. They were people who wanted to maintain liberty from slavery, which the British didn't want. Or they're people, this gentleman here smoking a pipe is a chief, a African Kalinago chief called Joseph Chatoyer, who wanted to push back the plantations that were coming to his island of St. Vincent. So in a sense, the people to the rear are the people that the British were fighting against. Their existence is precisely why the British created the West India Regiments to fight back. So in that way, you might think, well, this man is here because he's a representative of the opposition, the British opposition to this. But that brings us back to this painting for the last time. I mentioned that there was a mutiny in 1802. It took place in the island of Dominica, the one where the soldiers thought they were going to be re-enslaved. This painting is of the regiment that mutinied. And we don't know, and it dates from exactly that time. Now, we don't know, is this a man who was elsewhere in Dominica or perhaps elsewhere in the Caribbean? Is this a man who was one of the loyal soldiers who held the line and fought back against the mutineers? The mutineers crushed quite quickly. Or is this a mutineer? We don't know. But this, I think, is a reminder of why this is such an interesting and complex, and as I say, potentially ambiguous figure, and precisely why I used it for the front cover of my book. And I'll leave that there. Thank you.